Hello everyone, and welcome to the next edition of the Holland Land Office Museum's Artifact Video Series. My name is Ryan Duffy, and I'm the director of the museum. And this week we're going to talk about a topic that we did cover briefly in a previous video, in fact, the first video we ever did, but felt it was better to go back and talk about this one specific incident a little bit more, as it's truly a fascinating story and one of the darker tales from Genesee County's history. And that is the trial of Polly Frisch, who was accused of murdering her first husband and her children, as well as attempting to kill her second husband. Now, the story begins in 1844 when Polly Franklin, as she was known, married Henry Hogue, and they moved to Alabama. Now, between 1846 and 1856, they would have 8 children, though only 2 of them would live to adulthood. So their marriage was one of much tragedy, and would only get more tragic as it went on. In the summer of 1856, Henry started exhibiting symptoms of an unknown nature and fell ill quite severely. It was believed, at least at first, that he was suffering from cholera, as it is something he had dealt with previously, and it was a very common disease at the time, as he was suffering from body aches and chills and digestive issues and other aspects that maybe it would be associated with cholera, though it was unknown. And by July, Henry had actually died from his illness, which would still had gone undiagnosed. What made it even more odd is that shortly after that, their 6-year-old daughter, Frances, started coming down with the same symptoms and also passed away abruptly. Now, people thought this was somewhat suspicious, but didn't think too much of it, as Polly was seen as someone who was incapable of doing anything like killing her family, and there were too many other factors in there that could have made it some natural illness or some other cause other than foul play. Sentiment would start to change, though, as Polly remarried very quickly, and in the fall of 1856, she married a man named Otto Frisch. And suspicion continued to grow as Henry's family, or Polly's first husband, actually took away most of the kids and sent them with other family members, leaving only the youngest to stay with her mother and her now stepfather. So if Polly had been such a good mother and there wasn't suspicion from her in-laws, maybe the kids all would have stayed with her. About a year later, Otto starts coming down with very similar symptoms to Henry, and this caused an alarm in his head, as he thought, well, I've seen this before, at least how it was reported. Maybe I should get some medical attention. So he went to the local doctor, and he had basically told him he had been poisoned, and he was able to give him an antidote, and Otto was able to survive the ordeal. So this very much upset Otto, and as soon as he could, he left Polly and moved to Canada, where he started spouting off rumors that his wife had tried to poison him and he had to get away as fast as he could in order to save his life, because if he had stayed, she probably would have tried to do it again, as she had done with a previous husband. And this is really what gets the sort of legend of Polly Frisch going and causes the public eye to then turn on her. And right after Otto becomes ill, their 2-year-old daughter, Eliza Jane, also becomes ill with the same symptoms, and this starts ringing off all sorts of bells and gets everybody focused on Polly's. How is this happening again? And after Eliza Jane's death, actually Henry Hogue's cousin, who lived very near to the Frisches, actually contacts the Genesee County District Attorney to raise an alarm and say, there's something fishy going on here, and it needs to be investigated. And this is where the intensive part of the story starts to develop. And this leads to, in the next month, November 1857, Polly being arrested for possible crimes and possible murder of her family member. Now, Polly Frisch actually goes through several trials concerning the murders and attempted murders that happened within her households. So it's a very lengthy legal process that lasts several years and has several different outcomes. Now, the inquest into the cause of death for the various individuals starts in January 1858, and the conclusion that comes up after chemical tests by a chemist from Batavia that, to everybody's suspicion, that all the individuals had been poisoned with arsenic. She was charged with 3 counts of murder, all in the first degree, of her first husband, Henry Hogue, and her 2 daughters, Frances and Eliza Jane. Now, the first trial that was conducted was for the murder of Henry Hoag, and Polly was actually found not guilty by the jurors. And this was somewhat odd, as even Polly's own son testified against her. But it was deemed inconclusive that the illness could have been caused exclusively by the arsenic, and it might have been caused by an accident that he had on the farm, or some other type of illness that may have creeped in. So it was deemed inconclusive by the jurors that she poisoned him, and that's what killed. So in all, Polly would actually go through 5 separate trials, including the first one for the death of her husband, Henry Hoag. The second would be for the death of Eliza Jane. And actually in that one, Polly would be acquitted as directed by the judge in the case. The third trial was for the murder of Frances and actually resulted in a hung jury. However, it was retried, so her fourth trial, also for the death of Frances, and this resulted in a conviction as they dug up Frances's body and showed the contents of her stomach, and that's what turned the scale against her in terms of the jury's eyes and led to a guilty conviction. However, the judge made improper comments to the jury, which led to the verdict being overturned and the case being thrown out. So a fifth trial was held also to determine if she had killed Frances, and this is where the case takes a different turn, as her lawyers actually for the first time put forth the case of a plea of insanity, which they had not done in any of the previous cases. She was examined by local physicians, though was deemed to be sane, at least enough to stand trial, and the plea of insanity was actually thrown out. And she was convicted 2 years after she had first been arrested for the murder of her daughter Frances, and was sentenced to life in prison, though originally, due to the severity of the case, she was sentenced to death to be hung, and it would have actually been on the Genesee County gibbet, just like the one that's behind me here. However, the jury and the public at large was very hesitant about sending a woman to be executed, as it actually would have been one of the various early cases in the country's history, and it just didn't feel right to many of them. The sentence was actually commuted to life in prison, and Polly would serve out decades in various institutions. She would first be sent to Sing Sing prison and stay there until 1877, where she would be transferred to Kings County Penitentiary until 1892. It was there that the attending physician petitioned the governor of New York State that Polly's condition had completely changed and that she was past those impulses and she was no longer a threat to society. So in December of 1892, Polly Frisch was actually pardoned by the governor of New York State and was released from prison. And that is where our known story of Polly ends, as it is not known where she went, who she went with, and where she eventually ended up, though there have been much speculation. So this is one of the more interesting stories involved with the executions in Genesee County, even though an execution never actually happened, as it's the lone case that we have of a woman being potentially executed for her crimes, though the sentence was eventually commuted down to life in prison. If you'd like to know more about the story of Polly Frisch, this was just a very brief overture. There's a very good book called Bread and Butter. It was written by Sidney Amrine and Ellen Bakorsky, and it details the whole proceedings and much of Polly's life that is too long for this video. So if you're very interested, you can go on Amazon or other booksellers and probably find this book and really delve deep into it. But I hope you enjoyed this latest edition of our Artifact video series and sort of taking a step back and revisiting the case of Polly Frisch. If you've enjoyed any of our previous videos, and you can also go back and check out the first video on the history of the gibbet and some of the crimes and people executed upon it. You can go to our YouTube channel, HLOM Land Office Museum, and visit the playlist on our Artifact video series and go through as many as you like, as we're over 50 videos now. And please stick with us in the future, as we'll keep putting these out on different pieces of Genesee County's history. And if you've really enjoyed these videos and you'd like to know more, please stop by the museum and check out the gibbet for yourself, and I'll be happy to tell you a little bit more about Polly Frisch in the end.